Have you ever tried very hard to visit a friend? Not just any friend, a friend you like, but only sometimes. This is a story about such a friend, a sometimes friend who lives in a forest. The main character, he is a friend, a more than sometimes friend. He lives on the edge of the forest, a poet, he says, a poet with a sometimes friend. A pen the poet uses, a writing pen, one that paints pictures. A pen that paints? Can you imagine? A poet with a pen painting pictures of a sometimes friend who lives in the forest. The new sun rises over Christmas Eve day. The normally quiet poet paints onto the canvas, his bottom tucked tight into a very small chair. A blue chair. Just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise. A spectacle of wonder reflects images back to me. Big words for a poet, especially one sitting in a very small chair. A blue chair, just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise. Sky of gray, heavy from the rain, ice crystals hang from the tree limbs. Sky of gray, heavy from the rain, ice crystals hang from trees. How could this be? The poet with a pen paints pictures of sunrises and a sometimes friend who lives in the forest. Not crystallized gray from heavy rain. The ice is much too cold to play in. A moment of peace, a quiet place to sit, a chair for me to rest, to rebuild my strength. After all, it is Christmas Eve day. Paintings from a poet. A friendly poet. Words from his heart, lonely, gray, and cold. No Christmas tree well lit, no presents wrapped with pretty paper, not a box or card stamped with a giant bow. Not even a letter from a sometimes friend who lives in the forest. The poet only sits, staring from his blue chair. Sky of gray, heavy from the rain, ice crystals hanging from tree limbs.
What is Christmas?
A quite tiny, severely out of sight voice questioned. The poet must have heard it. He painted it with his pen right under the canvas. Looking toward the crystal forest, the gray an eighth of an inch higher than the horizon. No words were spoken, only poet thoughts of a sometimes friend who lives in the forest.
Look, everyone!
A much different, quite tiny, severely out of sight voice added.
A rhythm of warmth has come our way. Look, the pines and cedars are one and the same with the dogwoods, willows, and maples. Inform the queen, there is to be a celebration.
Indeed. In common they were. The pines, the cedars, the dogwoods, the willows, and maples, one and the same. From the gray sky, heavy with fallen rain, draped in ice, the entire forest. The very forest with a sometimes friend, a picture the poet would soon paint. A pen in his hand, a writing pen that paints, the poet creates a masquerade ball filled with song and dance. Guarded by soldiers, 3 to be exact, quite tiny, severely out of sight. Wooden soldiers, red, green, and white, in the very forest where the sometimes friend lives.
Who dare look this way without an invitation from the queen?
The quite tiny, severely out of sight red soldier tossed out, tossed like a ball. A yellow ball with a black stripe. Into the air it flew, landing firmly on the poet's canvas. The poet? He was surprised, so surprised you could see it in his eyes. A poet with a pen that paints with a sometimes friend who lives in a forest. He sits on a chair, a blue chair, just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise. And now someone asks,
Who dare look this way without an invitation from the queen?
how could this be? Whatever happened to the original story about he, the poet, and his sometimes friend, the one in the forest to whom the poet knows from living on the forest edge? Then again, maybe it's the queen, she who rules the forest, guarded by quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldiers, red, green, and white. Taking his pen, the one that paints, the poet's painted picture is that of this. It is I, the poet. I am here to see my sometimes friend, as well as the pines, the cedars, the willows, and maples. Oh, the poet with a pen that paints. Seems so nice to see his sometimes friend, he said. Then visit the pines, the cedars, the willows, and maples. That's a good friend, a more than sometimes friend. But before the poet could blink, he started to cough. He started to sneeze. He coughed and coughed and coughed and sneezed and sneezed and sneezed. He coughed and sneezed so much, the quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldiers, red, green, and white, sent the poet away, tossed him from the forest, far away from the queen, and with him, the poet took his pen. A writing pen that paints. Am I to assume? To take a guess? To wonder? To see that I am no longer in the forest? Does that mean I am not accepted? The poet questioned, while assuming guessing as well as wondering. In his chair he sat, the tiny blue chair, just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise. With his pen, the writing pen, the one that paints, the poet sharply questioned, what does this mean? To be thrown from the trees? A journey short-lived? Why had the quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldiers, red, green, and white, tossed pass me from the queen? Dipped into the well. The poet's pen, the writing pen that paints, sought to locate an answer to his question, his assumptions, his guessing and wondering. Why had he been tossed from the trees? Could it be that maybe? Would he possibly be the sometimes friend? Oh no, not the poet, not him or his pen, a writing pen that paints. If you remember well, all the way back to the beginning, the poet with the pen that paints was in search of a sometimes friend who lives in a forest. The poet cannot be, could not be, possibly be the sometimes friend, for he lives on the forest's edge. Then who did he wish to meet? Who was to bring his moment of peace, a quiet place to sit and rest, to rebuild his strength? I am left alone, a bird in a cage. The clock steals time from my day. The poet admits to himself while painting with his pen pictures of a lonely Christmas. The poet then sets down his pen, the writing pen that paints, gets up from his chair, the tiny blue chair just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise. For it looked as if the search for a sometimes friend was over. Walking away, slowly away, counting each step taken, the poet, for a moment, decided to look the forest's way. Sky of gray, heavy from the rain, ice crystals hanging from the trees. Within a second, maybe even less, quicker than a blink, much faster than the poet could think. The poet without a pen, the pen that paints, he could see with his eyes the quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldiers, red, green, and white. Above their heads, quite tiny in size, there was a sign that read, "Entrance to the palace dance floor." Walking to, slowly to, counting each step taken, the poet, for a moment, took notice of the queen. She must have seen just as he, the poet without his pen, the pen that paints, away from the chair, the blue chair, just the right size for painting pictures of a morning sunrise.
Merry Christmas, Mr. Poet.
The queen whispered. The queen whispered words, not pictures, soft words that could easily be heard.
Come back when my forest is green. Allow yourself to arrive at the birth of spring. Mr. Poet, you are what you search for. You are indeed the sometimes friend. You only visit when it is green, when it is spring. Right now my forest is nothing but ice. That is why you cannot stay. You do not like the forest when it is covered in ice. Merry Christmas, Mr. Poet. See you when all things are green in the spring.
The poet, without a pen, not even a forest to call his sometimes friend, stood silently, without sound. All things were quiet, very quiet. Even the quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldiers, red, green, and white, did not say or paint a single word. Shrugging his shoulders like he often did, the poet starts to leave the forest, only to return when it is green, when it is spring, to see the queen, the poet, the sometimes friend. Shrugging his shoulders just like before, the poet without a pen that paints, rubs his eyes, stomps his feet, then pinches his arm. Yes, the poet thinks to himself, it all must have been a dream, a bad dream, for how could it be, just maybe, that he, the poet, was the sometimes friend? Suddenly, a loud crash is heard. So loud was the crash, it forced the poet to turn to face the fogged-over window created by the gray sky, heavy with rain, ice crystals hanging from tree limbs. There, on the window, not a picture, not a painting, but words that couldn't be heard. Instead, they were words that could be read. Merry Christmas, Mr. Poet. Signed and dated by a sometimes friend, a quite tiny, severely out of sight wooden soldier, the green one, the one that looked like spring.